So let's see. You've heard a piece of this because he's in the program. There is a term that was invented by the military about 20 years ago, and that has been adopted by a lot of the big 5 accounting firms, a lot of management companies around the world. You may have heard of it. It's called VUCA, V-U-C-A. And that stands for volatile, unpredictable, complex, and ambiguous. And this describes the world after the end of the Cold War. That's why they invented it. And the Cold War is about right because I'm older than most of you, but I grew up during the Cold War. During the Cold War, the world and geopolitics and things like that were pretty straightforward. They weren't good. They were just very simple. They were very clear. So you had these two giant empires. You had the Warsaw Pact and you had NATO, who were against each other. And if you were a country that mattered, you just had to pick a side. Which side are you on? And that was it. It was very, very clear. Economics was very clear. The computer revolution really hadn't happened quite yet, so that was very clear. And so when the Cold War ended, the VUCA world began, where everything became volatile, unpredictable, complex, and ambiguous. And this is about right in terms of the end of the Cold War. That was 1989, right? And I've written about in my books how during the 90s, a bunch of things changed permanently in Western society. So we got rid of two things. We got rid of lifetime employment and lifetime marriage. Those two things went away in the 90s. Prior to the 90s, you could do what society told you to do. You could say, you may not be fulfilled or happy, but it would work. So prior to the 90s, your parents or society would say, okay, go to college. And you'd say, okay. And if you went to college, it was a pretty good idea. Pretty good deal back then. And then they would say, go get a good job with a good company, a big company will take care of you. Like, okay. And you were probably okay. And then they'd say, go get married. And you go, okay, and you got married, and it was okay for up until at least maybe the 70s when the divorce rate really started spiking. But it was fine. You were okay. The divorce rate back in the 50s was like 7%. It was fine. And then they say, okay, go have 2.3 children. You go, okay, yeah, I want kids, and you'd have kids, and it was okay. They were cheap to raise kids back then because taxes were lower, inflation was lower, cost of living was lower, the economy was booming, America was on the rise, and so you could follow these basic systems pre-VUCA, which would be like early 1990s. Does that make sense? Now, here's the problem. There's several issues. One is, what these companies don't talk about, or what the people who invented this firm don't talk about, or this term, is that not only are we now in a VUCA world since the early 90s, we're also in a scenario where every year the world gets more VUCA. It actually exacerbates and increases. So we are now today, we're 30 years into VUCA, right? We're 30 years since the early 90s. It's funny because I graduated high school, or should I say I completed high school, in 1990. So I was right in the middle of all this, right in the middle of the downsizing and right-sizing. That was a new thing in the 90s when all these companies started outsourcing all their stuff to India. Matter of fact, my biggest full-time job, corporate job, was doing tech support, which you can do it now, but most of that's done in India now. And I remember back then, they had just started to outsource that tech support function in other countries back in like 1992, 93, somewhere in there. So we're 30 years into this now, right? So let's not take the last 30 years. Let's look at like the last 10, okay? So let's take each letter. V-U-C-A, volatile. Is the world more or less volatile now than it was 10 years ago? It's more. So for example, I can give you 1,000 examples. Here's an easy one. When I talk about the Western world collapsing, I get some pushback from guys that say, well, not Eastern Europe. Western Europe, yeah, Western Europe's fine, but Eastern Europe's fine. Eastern Europe doesn't have all the immigration stuff that Western Europe has. They don't have the welfare state. They're lower economically, and so it's a little more stable. Well, then Putin invades Ukraine, and now Eastern Europe's fucked. So the world is more volatile now just the past 10 years. Okay? So you say unpredictable. Is the world more or less unpredictable now than it was just 10 years ago? Way more unpredictable because I've talked about this. Here's another example for unpredictability. This is the first time in my lifetime, I've mentioned this before, where I cannot predict what investments will do well. I can't do it. I've been able to do this my whole adult life prior to now. So in the 90s, I saw the baby boomers get into the housing market. So real estate was the obvious play in the 90s. I made a lot of money in real estate. In the 2000s, I saw George W. Bush become elected president and spend money to trillions of dollars more than we've ever seen in human history, which Obama and Trump have copied. And he printed all this money, and gold was artificially low, and I said, okay, gold's going to do well, and I made a lot of money with gold. And then in the 2000 teens, it started getting more unpredictable. I started getting less sure, but I made a lot of money in Bitcoin in 2017? Somewhere in there. Today, you look at the world, what's going to do well? I don't know. It's the first time. It's just totally unpredictable now. It was a lot more predictable just 10 years ago. I mean, well, people say, well, Bitcoin. Bitcoin is a good idea. I have a lot of Bitcoin. But Bitcoin's been sitting on its ass for like a year and a half.
I don't think the Bitcoin, because I study all that, I don't think any of that's going to do anything again until 2024.
What?
Until the next Bitcoin halving. Because everything's based on the Bitcoin halving. It's basic supply.
Is that a fork?
It's basic supply. No, it's just basic supply and demand. So the Bitcoin halving is each block that's mined after the next halving will be half the amount. That's what happened in 2020. May of 2020, it went from 12 Bitcoins per block to 6.5 Bitcoins per block.
Right.
And then you always see a run up just prior to the halving because everybody's trying to front run it. And then you see it drop. And then you see the long bull run after that as supply shock starts to happen. And then the people that make money off Bitcoin roll their funds over into altcoins. And then you see it just bounce back and forth from altcoins to Bitcoin until max supply shock has happened, and then you see the crash.
You studied this more than I have. Cool. Okay.
Yeah.
So you're saying the next halving is in 2024?
You'll have to look it up, but yeah, it's like 2024, 2025.
Okay. Yeah.
And it's based on how many blocks have been mined, so it's not an exact date, but there's all kinds of nerds out there that have algorithms that have it pretty precise. So.
I just did a video. Well, to that point. Bitcoin has been sitting around 30K-ish for over a year, which is new. And I just did a YouTube video a while back where for the first time in my life, this is also happening with gold. Gold's been sitting at about 1,800, be 18, 19 for years, even with all the inflation, even with all the money printing and all that stuff, because I think Bitcoin has stole a lot of that. So I actually sold some gold and bought Bitcoin for the first time in my life. But anyway, this is the first time in my lifetime where I can't definitively point at something and say, this is the place you want to be. I mean, there's a few places I have guesses on, maybe apartment buildings. But anyway, I don't know because everything's become more unpredictable.
Apartment buildings in the U.S. or international?
Both.
Both.
U.S. too. I don't like investing in the U.S., but U.S., yeah.
I think it's those large scale ones.
Yeah,
like
we're moving away. The U.S., this is part of Western collapse. The U.S. is moving away from home ownership, moving toward apartment ownerships. Yeah. We're moving toward a renter society. Some of it's good, like in the future, you won't need to buy a car unless you really want to. Because everything will be robotic and available and just, that's where you will own nothing and be happy. There's a piece of that I like. Most of it's horrible. But there's a piece that I like is I don't want it to buy a car if I don't need to buy a car. It's great. I don't own a car.
Just so am I.
What's that?
Just so.
Oh, you did? Okay.
I had a
All
buddy
right. There you
doing
go.
handling sale while I was in Mexico.
Yeah, I haven't owned a car now in, 2 years now? Makes me very happy. But we could be a little more efficient with things like Uber, but we will. So VUC, complex. Is the world more or less complex now than it was 10 years ago? It's significantly more complex, just in 10 years. And it's going to get more complex as time goes on. And then A is ambiguous. So is the world more or less ambiguous now than it was 10 years ago? Same thing. That's why I don't know it's going to do well. It's harder to tell now because it's not as clear as it has been. So not only do we live in a VUCA world, we're going to be in a scenario where every year becomes more and more volatile, unpredictable, complex, and ambiguous. It's going to be worse in 5 years than it is today. It's going to be worse in 10 years, 20 years, until such time as things stabilize, and maybe they will at some point. They probably will. But my guess is we're looking at decades. That's my guess. I could be wrong. But it's not going to get any better anytime soon in terms of whether things become more or less VUCA. I've said this before. Things will get better in terms of like technological growth. That'll be great. But that's one of the few things that'll be better.
Is there when you say that, my mind immediately goes, and I know I'm reconditioning myself. I'm thinking domestic. I'm thinking U.S. But how much of that VUCA is scale like?
It's the whole world.
Weighted the whole. I know, but like if a guy in Laos in the mountains selling pineapples from his stand from his farm,
he's
how
fine.
much is that affected?
No, he's fine, but he's the exception.
Slow, less to fall down.
Right. Right. That was the point of people. Yeah, and that was the point of people in Eastern Europe who said Eastern Europe will do less poorly during European collapse. It's true because they're already lower. Yeah. That's why one of my base of operations is Paraguay. No one gives a shit about Paraguay, and they just trade with people around them. And so I've said this before, if America collapsed tomorrow, People in Paraguay wouldn't even notice. They'd hear it on the news,
Right.
and oh, that's interesting, and that was it. Their life would go on, more or less. It'd be the same thing. So yeah, that's true, but that's the exception. We live in a smaller world, especially if you're in the first world, where everything's interconnected now. I mean, all this stuff about, and this is more conspiracy theory-ish stuff, but it's not. The repeaters and routers in the ocean for the internet, if there's a solar flare, they're right about that. If there's a solar flare, and the odds are low. But they had a big one in the 80s in Canada, knocked out a few places in Canada. You could have a scenario where the internet would work, but it wouldn't work across the world. So if I'm in Dubai, the internet would work in Dubai, but I wouldn't be able to access anything in North America.
And not to sound too, because I'm not even going to reveal my sources, but 2027 is something coming through. I won't even.
I don't believe in conspiracy items
But
that attach specific
target date
dates.
for them pulling that shit. And
I don't believe in specific dates.
2020. I know.
Because if those are right, I could be a billionaire. Because I get email. I have a big audience. I get emails all the time from guys. Caleb, October this year, what they're going to do is this, and it never happens. You should have seen when Trump was, January, last January, when Biden quote unquote won the election. I got all these emails in January, before January 6th. Caleb, you understand, Trump is going to stun the world and become president and make America great again. You don't understand, kids. You just don't understand. Yeah, so I'm not saying you're in that category, but whenever things that have a specific dates attached, I'm like, how do you know?
I think it's in the playbook though. That's one of the things of part of the VUCA, I guess.
So, knowing that we are in a VUCA world, we exist and operate in that world. So financially and sexually and all those other things, we exist in that world, and it's going to get worse every year. Let's now look at the opposite. So if you look at the opposite, and this is what they don't do, this is something I've done. So if you look at VUCA, let's look at the opposite. So the opposite of volatile is stable, okay? The opposite of unpredictable is predictable. Well, let's go through each one. The opposite of volatile is stable. So if you have stable income versus income that bounces up and down, even if you have a very high income, you've got issues around that. You have to deal with banks, you have to deal with savings accounts, you have to deal with, and in your relationship life, if you have a stable relationship life with a woman or women, and it lasts many, many years versus up and down, more of a pickup artist guy where you're up and down, you're getting laid, then you have sex for 6 months, and then you get laid again, then you have a girlfriend, then you break up in 6 months, and there's a difference. You want stability because stability will make you more happy. So then you have U is predictable, VUC. Complex, opposite of complex is simple. So you want to simplify everything you possibly can in your life. It's super critical. I learned this from one of my mentors, Brian Tracy. Simplify. It's one of the core steps he teaches. Everything needs to be simplified. The smarter you are, the more complex you're going to want to make stuff. And you're all in that category. Most guys in my audience in that category. I tend to attract intelligent guys to my content, which is great. But the problem with intelligent guys, they want to make everything more fucking complicated. You got to make it simple. And once it's simple, you want to keep it simple, which is hard because over time things get more complex.
Yeah.
Because you're going to be living in a VUCA world. Last one is A is ambiguous. The opposite of ambiguous is clear, clarity. And I talk about having very clear goals, very clear objectives. So instead of saying, I want to make more money, that's not a goal. I want to be location independent, that's not a goal. That's not clear, that's ambiguous. Or even your woman life or any other aspect. You have very specific benchmarks and very specific numbers attached to what you want. So that would be, the opposite of VUCA is SPSC.
What was the first S?
Stable.
Stable, thank you.
Stabilize.
Should write this down, shouldn't I? Have those memorized.
I got it.
Thank you. Thank you. SPSC is the opposite. So if we live in a VUCA world, where does the SPSC come from? It comes from you. So your job in the next few decades is to be the SPSC, is to be simple, stable, predictable, simple, and clear. Because no one else external from you is going to do this for you. The economy is not going to do this for you. Your friends aren't going to do this for you. Your family is going to do this for you. Your business, for the most part, if you leave it on its own, is not going to do this for you. Your relationship life is not going to do this for you. Women sure as hell aren't going to do this for you. You have to do this. You have to be the source of this in your life going forward for the next at least 25 years. And that's more important now, like I said, than it was 30 years ago pre-VUCA, where you could just be a normal beta male guy. You could be a normal typical guy who went along with whatever his mom told him and he'd be fine. So you have to be the source of this. And I talk about in my books how in my Alpha Male 2.0 content, I talk about how you should be a bubble of order. So you have this yourself in the middle of the sphere. This is how I visualize it. And in this sphere, everything's orderly because that's SPSC. And the only other people you want in that sphere, if you want, is if you live full time with a woman. So I have a wife, so she's in there with me. And then if you have kids who are below 18. Do any of you have kids below 18? No. Okay, so you have to worry about that. So you're simpler than I am. That's it. And so outside of that is chaos, but within your sphere is order. So your business, your finances, your relationship life, everything. SPSE. That has to come from you because it's not going to come from anywhere else. Matter of fact, it's going to push it on the opposite. One of the rules of the universe is that negative is automatic and positive requires energy. So that applies to you. If you just sit on your ass and do nothing, you will go bankrupt, you'll be miserable, right? You'll gain weight, all these horrible things will happen if you do nothing. You have to exert energy to create positive. If nothing happens in space, you get darkness. Darkness is automatic. You have to create darkness, it's just there. You have to create light. So the SPSC, right, has to come from you through effort. And so hopefully by the end of today, you'll have the tools or more tools to go build or to maintain or improve your SPSC in whatever areas you need. That's why we're here today. And like I said, this is more important now than it has been, certainly in my lifetime. I was born in the early 70s. That makes sense?